June 22, 1944. Eastern Front. Belarus. Dawn comes slowly to the forests of Belarus. Mist clings to the marshlands. Pine needles drip with cold moisture. The German trenches are quiet, almost peaceful. It has been months since this sector has seen decisive action. Officers of Army Group Center believe the front here is stable. Behind the German lines, supply columns idle in mud. Field telephones hum softly. Sentries stamp their boots against the damp chill, 5 kilometers away, hidden beneath tree cover and camouflaged netting. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers wait in absolute silence. At exactly 5 o'clock. The silence shatters. 7,000 Soviet guns open fire in unison. The earth convulses. The artillery barrage is not random. It is calculated. It is rehearsed. It is the opening note of something far larger than an offensive. It is the execution of a strategy designed months earlier. A strategy meant not just to defeat German divisions, but to dismantle an entire army. To understand how this moment was engineered, we must step back 3 years. To the summer when Germany first crossed into Soviet territory, June 22, 1941, 3 years before the guns thundered across Belarus. More than 3 million German soldiers surged eastward in Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest invasion in human history. The objective was clear: destroy the Soviet Union in a single, crushing campaign. German armored spearheads advanced with staggering speed. Minsk fell within a week. Smolensk followed. By autumn, the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow. Soviet armies disintegrated in vast encirclements. Entire fronts vanished. At the center of this advance stood Army Group Center, the formation tasked with driving straight toward Moscow. It was the strongest of Germany's 3 army groups, heavily armored, confident, and aggressive, but distance became an enemy. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers. Rail gauges did not match. Fuel shortages slowed the panzers. Then winter arrived, sudden, brutal, unforgiving. The offensive stalled outside Moscow in December 1941. The myth of invincibility cracked through 1942 and 1943. The Eastern Front became a war of attrition. Germany still occupied vast territory, but momentum had shifted. The Soviet Union rebuilt its shattered armies east of the Urals. Factories produced tanks in numbers Germany could not match. The decisive fracture came in July 1943 at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Germany attempted one final offensive to regain initiative. It failed. Soviet counterattacks pushed relentlessly westward. By early 1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer advancing. It was holding, yet in the center of the front, stretching across the forests and marshes of Belarus, German lines appeared firm. Intelligence estimates suggested the next Soviet blow would fall in Ukraine, where oil fields and open terrain offered greater strategic value. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler believed the central sector was secure. That belief would shape every decision that followed, and it would blind him to the danger gathering quietly in the north. By the spring of 1944, the Eastern Front stretched more than 1,600 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. German forces were thinly spread, but nowhere more deceptively calm than in Belarus. Here, Army Group Center held a vast defensive arc anchored on fortified cities: Vitebsk in the north, Orsha guarding the Moscow highway, Mogilev along the Dnieper, and Bobruisk protecting southern approaches. Nearly 800,000 German troops manned this sector. On paper, it looked formidable, but the terrain told another story. Belarus was a labyrinth of forests, rivers, and marshland. Rail lines were limited. Roads dissolved into mud after rain. For mechanized retreat, it was one of the worst landscapes in Europe. German intelligence, reading Soviet troop movements through radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance, concluded that the main Soviet summer offensive would strike further south, toward Ukraine and Romania's oil fields. Soviet deception operations reinforced this belief. False radio traffic suggested armored concentrations in the south. Dummy tank parks appeared where none existed. Rail movements were staged at night in the north. Masked by silence and camouflage, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, was orchestrating something precise. At its center stood Operation Bagration. Named after a Russian general of the Napoleonic Wars, the objective was not a limited breakthrough. It was the destruction of an entire German army group. More than 2.3 million Soviet troops assembled across 4 fronts. Over 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Nearly 30,000 artillery pieces and mortar. Air superiority carefully prepared, the plan was not merely to push the Germans back, it was to fracture their lines in multiple sectors simultaneously, isolate strongpoints, and collapse the entire structure before reinforcements could react. And at the heart of this design was a strategic concept refined through years of brutal experience, a method intended to fight not at the front line, but through it. The Soviet doctrine of maskirovka, military deception, had evolved through failure and survival. By 1944, it had become an operational science. Entire tank armies were hidden in forests under layered camouflage nets. Artillery was positioned at night. Radio silence was imposed across assault sectors. Engineers constructed false bridges in southern sectors to mislead German reconnaissance. Dummy fuel depots and fake supply concentrations were deliberately exposed to enemy aircraft. German intelligence monitored radio signals. The Soviets flooded the southern front with fabricated transmissions, creating the impression of a massive build-up toward Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Belarus, silence reigned. Even German aerial reconnaissance struggled. Soviet fighters aggressively patrolled the skies, limiting Luftwaffe observation. Rail traffic moved only at night. Troops marched through wooded corridors, concealed from view. By June 1944, the German High Command remained convinced the decisive blow would fall elsewhere. The deception was not tactical. It was strategic. Angle 2. Deep battle doctrine behind the camouflage stood a second, more decisive element: operational depth. After the disasters of 1941 and 1942, Soviet planners had refined what they called deep battle. It rejected the idea of a single breakthrough followed by pursuit. Instead, it envisioned multiple, simultaneous penetrations designed to shatter command, logistics, and reserves far behind the front. Frontline defenses would be overwhelmed by concentrated artillery. Behind them, mobile groups at tank armies and mechanized corps would surge through the rupture, driving dozens of kilometers in days. This was not attrition. It was disintegration. At the operational level, commanders like Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky coordinated for separate Soviet fronts to attack simultaneously along a 700-kilometer arc. The objective was mathematical. If German reserves were committed north, the center would collapse. If sent south, northern sectors would unravel. If held back, each sector would fall in sequence. The German system relied on controlled withdrawals and counterattacks to stabilize breaches, but there would be no single breach. There would be many, and they would open at once. The stage was set for confrontation, not only of armies, but of leadership philosophies. By mid-1944, Adolf Hitler no longer trusted his generals. After the setbacks of Stalingrad and Kursk, he tightened control over operational decisions. Withdrawal required personal approval. Defensive lines were to be held at all costs. Cities were declared Festungen, fortress strongholds, expected to resist encirclement indefinitely. In Belarus, this rigidity would prove catastrophic. German field commanders warned that the terrain offered poor defensive depth. The front bulged outward, exposed on both flanks. Intelligence reports hinted at unusual Soviet activity. Yet Berlin interpreted the data through assumption. The main offensive would strike further south. Hitler's assessment shaped deployment. Armored reserves were positioned away from the central sector. Reinforcements moved toward Ukraine. Army Group Center was ordered to hold its ground. Even if attacked, the doctrine that had once enabled German success, rapid maneuver, elastic defense, flexible retreat, was replaced by static resolve. When the blow fell, mobility would be denied. Angle 4. Soviet command and coordination. The opposing side stood a leadership structure transformed by experience. The Stavka, the Soviet High Command, had learned through immense sacrifice. Early war chaos had been replaced with procedural discipline. Logistics were centralized. Air support was synchronized with ground movements. Engineering units rehearsed river crossings months in advance. At the operational level, coordination between fronts was unprecedented. The First Baltic Front would strike toward Vitebsk. The Third and Second Belarusian fronts would shatter the center near Orsha and Mogilev. The First Belarusian Front, under Rokossovsky, would drive toward Bobruisk with a controversial double envelopment plan. Initially, Stalin questioned Rokossovsky's insistence on attacking along two axes. Rokossovsky stood firm, arguing the marshlands allowed a concealed southern thrust. After repeated review, The dual assault was approved. The decision ensured that German forces at Bobruisk would not face pressure from